We like to picture the Roman legions as unstoppable forces of nature, men fueled by discipline, honor, and raw courage, marching across Europe and crushing everything in their path. Behind every shield wall was a supply chain of staggering complexity. Thousands of deployed men needed rations, roads, and regular pay. Their siege engines required massive amounts of timber and labor. Every piece of armor, like the forged iron and brass in these helmets, represented an immense cost that had to be multiplied across entire armies. In the early Republic, the military was a citizen army. If you owned land, you brought your own weapons and fought, expecting to return to your crops after a year. But as the borders pushed further away from Rome, campaigns stretched for years. You couldn't leave your farm to fight in Spain and expect your family to survive. The old model broke down. Rome needed professional soldiers. The state had to step in and centralize military financing. They began paying stipends to keep those professional ranks full and loyal. Rome rested on a foundation of massive systemic debt. This financial engine made expansion a mathematical requirement for the state's survival. When Rome fought massive, multi-generational conflicts, like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the treasury emptied quickly. To keep the legions equipped, the Republic was forced to take out huge public loans from its own wealthy citizens. These lenders were the equites, Rome's rising financial class. They were not making patriotic donations to save the state. They were making investments, and they expected serious returns. Those returns came directly from the conquered territories. Every new province brought fresh taxes, slave labor, captured gold mines, and heavy tribute. Conquest itself had become a highly profitable business. The mechanics were straightforward. The state borrows money to fund a war. The army conquers new land. The state extracts wealth from that land to pay the interest on the debt. To keep paying, they need more revenue, which means starting the next war. Private contractors, known as the publicani, managed the logistics and skimmed fortunes off the top. Political power shifted to generals who promised the best spoils. These men became shareholders in violence, pushing the state into endless conflicts because the profit margins were enormous. The state was trapped. Expanding the borders was no longer a strategic choice. It was a strict economic requirement just to prevent a catastrophic default. The earth is only so large. Eventually, you run out of profitable regions to conquer, resources to extract, and enemies to loot. When the conquest slowed, the incoming revenue dried up. But the compounding debt obligations from centuries of borrowing did not disappear. This is the Roman denarius, the standard silver coin of the empire. To cover the shortfall without admitting they were broke, emperors starting with Nero used a desperate hack. They quietly melted down the currency and reminted it with less actual silver. This chart shows the result. Over 2 centuries, the silver content in the denarius steadily dropped, turning a reliable currency into a thin piece of metal backed by nothing. Prices skyrocketed. The lower classes saw their purchasing power evaporate, struggling to afford basic goods. Meanwhile, the political elites shielded their fortunes by moving their wealth into hard assets like land and slaves, isolated from the inflation they created. The treasury was hollowed out, corruption soared, and the public lost all faith in the system. Rome's monetary foundation was in freefall long before the first enemy soldier ever set foot inside the city. Look at the global economy right now. We see governments running massive perpetual deficits and financing overseas conflicts entirely through borrowing. While our modern financial system is far more complex, the underlying incentives remain eerily familiar. Modern states rely on taxation and quantitative easing to manage obligations that mirror the Roman cycle of tribute and debasement. Wars are still fought on credit. Think of the trillions spent in places like Afghanistan. The contracts flow to a new financial class, enriching private defense companies and lenders, while the public is left holding the tab. The bills are paid through the stealth tax of inflation. The wealthy continue to buy up hard assets, while the average person goes to the grocery store and watches their paycheck buy less and less food. When a state gets trapped by its own debt, it stops needing an emergency to print money. It prints it just to avoid a collapse, normalizing the exact same destructive habits that ruin the denarius. Systemic failure usually precedes military defeat. When the underlying math of an empire stops working, the gates are already open. You can't opt out of this modern digital empire. But you don't have to navigate it blindly. Look at the flow of credit through these systems. Examine who lends the capital, who earns the interest, and who ultimately bears the cost of the inflation. These records of past debt and debasement serve as a map of systemic power, one that signals a clear warning for the modern era.